Hello and welcome to this episode of Hats Off to Bake Off, an amateur baking podcast. My name is Malory. I'm here with my friend Nick, and today we are going to walk through episode 3 of collection 1 or series 5 of the Great British Bake Off. This week, it's bread week. So we're going to talk through the signature, the technical, and the showstopper challenge that the bakers handle in the tent. And we're also going to learn a little bit more about gluten, and then we're going to go over the bakes that Nick and I tried to make in the comfort of our own apartments. Nick, do you want to talk about a little about where we are right now? It's a little bit different this episode than previous episodes. Hello and welcome to Hats Off to Bake Off, an amateur baking podcast. My name is Malory. I am here with my friend Nick, and today we are going to be walking through episode 3 of collection 1 or series 5 of the Great British Bake Off. This week, it's bread week, and so we're going to walk through the signature, the technical, and the showstopper challenge that the bakers faced in the tent this week, and then also the bakes that Nick and I tried to do in our own homes, and then also get a bonus lesson about the importance of gluten and the science behind how it works. So Nick, do you want to talk a little bit about where we are right now? We got a sort of different setup this week.
Yeah, I'm doing fine. I'm sitting at home in the dark with the light on. You are far away in your home. We did not get a chance to bake together today, which is really upsetting.
Yeah, this is a special quarantine episode of Hats Off to Bake Off. We baked separately and then sent each other lots of pictures. So not quite the same, but staying safe, washing our hands.
But we had some moderately successful bakes. That's exciting.
Yeah, bread week. I really like bread week. I love baking bread. I think it can be daunting if you don't know what you're doing, but it's really always been very relaxing for me. So I was excited to try something new. I've never baked with rye flour before, and that was the challenge that I chose to take on, was the signature rye roll challenge. So that was really fun for me.
Every time I go to bake, I'm like, I got bread down, bread will be fine. And then sometimes it very much isn't, and sometimes it works out fine. I don't really know. But I think I mentioned this in our introduction episode, that the two things that I really wanted to learn to bake were cake, like how to decorate a cake really nicely, and how to bake bread. And so a year or so ago, I bought a bunch of bread flour and a bunch of yeast and tried to bake once or twice, and then life got in the way. But with quarantine, with all our jobs, working from home and whatnot, I'm just I've got plenty of time. I've baked at least 3 different things this week, so I'm using my time wisely.
Yeah, so you went above and beyond this week. You did 2 of the 3 challenges, which I was very impressed by.
I did I did ciabatta, and I did the filled loaf, just kind of a simple filled loaf, which I don't know if that went really well, but we'll talk about that.
Yay, I'm so excited to hear about them. Well, okay, so we're also going to reorganize a little bit the structure of the episode this week, because the lesson here, rather than a history lesson, is a science lesson, and it's about one of my favorite things in baking, especially in baking bread, and something that I think is both very cool and very underrated, and that's gluten. And we wanted to talk to you about really what it is and how it works, why it's important, how you can make sure that you're using it properly in a bake. And since all of the bakes this week are bread and use gluten, we figured we should get that out of the way first so that you have some idea and that we can talk through that sort of and reference that while we're talking about the bakes that we did and the bakes that the bakers in the tent did as well.
Sounds perfect. I mean, you've gone full deep dive into the science of gluten. A friend of ours was like, what is the difference between bread flour and regular flour? And I was like, Malory, where are you, Malory? You know this better than I do.
Let me tell you all about it.
But you understand the excitement of learning about something. Whenever I came in, I was like, I know, but savory biscuits. Look at me. You understand that excitement now, which is exciting.
Yes, I am really excited to finally carry my share of the weight for this podcast and actually get to dig in and do some research about a topic that I think is really interesting. So,
well, we promised food science, so we're going to do it.
Here it is. So I really wanted to start back with really what gluten's purpose is in the natural world and what it is in general. So gluten is actually a combination of different proteins that occur naturally in various types of grain, mostly wheat, but also in barley and rye. And these wheat proteins are called glutenin and gliadin. And they have like slightly different names for the gluten compounds that appear in barley and rye, but we'll be talking pretty much exclusively about gluten and gliadin. And so in nature, these are storage proteins. So their job is to make sure that the grain seeds have enough amino acids for germination. And so it's basically like providing food for the grain. But in baking, when they're combined with water, or when those two proteins get hydrated, they combine together and they form what we know as gluten, which then can be further developed by mixing or kneading the bread dough.
So is gluten actually in the wheat, or is it something that is created when you start baking with it?
So gluten is created via or through the hydration. In wheat, it's these two proteins that then combine into a different protein structure when hydrated.
Gotcha.
So that's why a lot of times, instead of talking about the gluten content of different flours, they will instead say the sort of gluten potential of different flours, because it's not technically gluten yet, but it has the potential to yield higher gluten depending on the protein content of the flour. Because that's something that's really important to understand, is that gluten is a protein. And so when you're looking at flours that may or may not contain more gluten or less gluten, protein content is going to be a big part of that.
So that's what when I said, like, when my friends were like, hey, what is bread flour? Why is it different? I was like, I don't really know the difference, but basically there's more protein in there, and that's all that I know. So that's good to know that makes sense.
Yeah, that's basically it. And then the reason why we're looking for this, and specifically why we want a higher protein and a higher gluten, sure, higher
gluteens. You know, it's
teens.
Bread for teens.
Bread for teens. This is our new branded product.
Hot Pod, bread for teens, because teens don't love bread enough.
Anyways,
you were saying.
I was saying that so we're looking often when we're making bread for flours with higher gluten content, because the job of gluten in bread is that it's very elastic. So it's the perfect material to trap and hold all of the gases that are released by the yeast during fermentation or proofing. And so basically, if you aren't familiar with what happens to your bread before it becomes bread, basically flour and water are combined with yeast and sometimes salt, and the yeast eats the sugars in the dough and creates carbon dioxide, and that creates bubbles in the dough. But then the job of the gluten is to hold those bubbles in, and that elasticity is what helps the dough rise. It's what gives baked bread its sort of classic airy pockets and chewy texture. And then the springiness and the tension in gluten also helps bread loaves actually get a uniform rise and bake. So that's something I didn't realize that gluten did as well, is that it's very much responsible for the fact that, like, you'll watch just like a loaf rise perfectly evenly. It's that tension and that sort of being pulled together and apart at the same time of gluten that helps that happen in a rise.
Okay, that makes sense. Like when you're doing that thing where you have to sit on the ground, you hold each other's hands, you have to like stand up together, like it's you pulling away from your partner that helps keep the bread dough even.
That's a really good metaphor for it, actually. I hadn't thought about that, but I really like that. And this also really helps us to understand why gluten-free breads tend to have a texture that's much more similar to a cake than a traditional loaf. It's because there's no mechanism to hold all the air that was created by the yeast, so it ends up having a much more cake-like crumb to it. There's no bubbles and pockets of air in there because there's no sort of elastic structure that can actually like physically hold in the bubble.
That makes sense.
As I mentioned earlier, for gluten to develop, you not only need to hydrate it, but you actually also need to mix it or knead it. And this is because kneading actually breaks down and rearranges the protein chains in gluten to form a more complex web of connection. So basically, and this is where I'm going to get a little bit technical. Chemically, what's happening here is that the hydration of the flour starts these different chemical bonds. There's ionic bonds, hydrogen bonds, and disulfide bonds, which are a type of covalent bond. I won't force you to relive high school chemistry, which I definitely did go back and like make sure I knew what each of those were before throwing those terms in here.
I always wanted to be good at chemistry, and I was never any good at chemistry. I was that nerd who liked science but like wasn't quite good enough at it.
I can definitely relate to that. I feel like baking has made me want to hone my chemistry skills. And so we'll get a taste of that right now. So I actually, I know what all those things mean now, basically. But now all of these proteins are either sharing different atoms or like molecular bonds, or they're sharing different electrons. And that's sort of what helps with the tension, specifically those hydrogen bonds that are happening there. But then also the kneading actually increases the total number of bonds that are happening. So this is called cross-links. And so as you continue to knead, what you're doing is you're sort of forcing more and more of these protein molecules to come into contact with one another, and that's forming more and more cross-links. So you're getting this thicker and thicker net of proteins that's then better able to trap air.
I think in Masterclass, Paul does this really, really basic version of that where he just like puts his hands together and goes like, they're trying to grip each other, and then they grab each other and hold on tight. And, I was like, that's the strangest way to explain this. But I think, if I understand you correctly, he's literally talking about those like ionic bonds holding on to each other.
Yeah.
So you're getting elasticity and tension from, atoms.
Exactly. And another really good metaphor I found online for this is that if you think about spaghetti that you've cooked and then you pour into a colander to let sit, and how like if you let it sit without any sort of fat or anything, it will slowly, the noodles will all sort of come together.
Okay.
It's that same sort of idea as they're all going to like attach to each other in more and more ways.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So how did you find any, like, what are the best ways to produce that gluten to get those bonds moving?
So really any type of kneading or mixing, there isn't one specific way of kneading that I've found to be necessarily more effective. But really, I think the best way to do it is to involve lots of stretching, because one of the signs that you've properly developed your gluten is that it is stretching properly. If your dough is breaking and not stretching, it's a sign that you need to keep kneading. And so one of the ways to test that you've actually developed your gluten properly is something that we see the bakers do in the tent all the time, and that's the window pane test.
I was going to ask you about that because that is the most bizarre thing. If you look it up on the internet, people are so confused by this concept.
Oh, really?
And then some people are like, yeah, of course you use the window pane test. Some people will say like you need to prod it, or some people will say like if it springs back, it's good. And sometimes it's just like use the window pane test. It's perfect. It'll let you know. Like, what are they really looking for when they do the window pane test?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are a lot of different ways that you can sort of tell that gluten is starting to be activated and developed. But the window pane test is really effective for one simple reason, and that's that you're basically pretending to be an air bubble. And so to do the window pane test, and you'll see the bakers doing this if you watch the episode, they're taking a small bit of the dough and then stretching it between their fingers to see how thin they can get the dough. And if they can get the dough thin enough to see through, that means the gluten is developed enough. And really what you're doing there is you're mimicking the air bubbles that are going to be created by the yeast. And so if your window pane pops, the air bubbles created by the yeast will too.
So it's less about like seeing the gluten strands and more about like how stretchy your dough has become?
Yes. So you're not going to see individual gluten strands or anything, but like the nature and if it stretches enough for you to see through it, that means that they've built up enough of a thick web between each other that they can stretch that far without breaking. And that means that it'll hold those air bubbles in without sort of letting any through.
That makes light years more sense, because I feel like, so we're talking about the very first episode of Bake Off that came to America. That's, I think, probably the first time I've ever heard of the window pane test.
Same here.
Was that, I think it was Martha who's the first person who's like, you can just do this. And I was like, what are you doing? What is that?
It's changed my whole life, though. Like, I think it's a really, really effective way to test for gluten development. There's definitely other ways that you can do it, but I did want to also go through some signs that your dough isn't ready or signs that your dough is, in fact, over kneaded.
I definitely could have used this afternoon, so go for it.
Okay, great. We're a little late on the uptake here, but signs that your dough isn't ready are mostly that it tears when pulled and it does not spring back when prodded. So that's why I think it's really important to incorporate some sort of stretching into your kneading method. So the way that I tend to knead my dough is I'll sort of take my left palm and hold down the end towards me, and then take my right edge of my palm and stretch up and stretch as far as it will go. And then I'll take and then use my same right palm to sort of roll it back onto itself rotate it 180 degrees, or really 90 degrees, I guess, and then keep going and do that same process over again. So I'm like rotating and then like stretching, rolling it back, and then stretching in a different direction, rolling it back. And then that really helps me be able to see that once it starts being able to stretch as I stretch it rather than just ripping or tearing, then that means I'm getting close.
Okay, so yeah, my bread this afternoon was just tearing everywhere. I'm sure there are more difficulties than just how much I needed it, but I could have sworn I needed it for 30 minutes there, but it just kept on breaking. So
was it an enriched dough?
It wasn't enriched.
Okay,
dough.
Great. We'll get to that in a second. That's pretty cool.
Okay, cool. I was going to say the way I usually knead dough is something I learned from Tasty because, I love them.
As a Bon Appetit test kitchen stand, I have to say that. I don't know how I feel about this whole Tasty fan thing of yours.
Yeah, Bon Appetit is far better than Tasty, but sometimes Tasty is just what you need. Little YouTube pick-me-up. But they have a series, that's like the Tasty 101 series, talk about how to make good bread. And she does the heart method, which is basically just what you said, just little like you push and scrape the dough across the board with one hand going the opposite direction. And then you roll it back using that hand. Then you switch hands and press in the opposite direction. It is the heart method because you kind of make this little heart shape with the two diagonal pushes. But it was just a kind of a good, like it made sense in my brain to work. But I think I've seen a lot of pro chefs use that technique, so I'll probably start doing that next time I try it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then just in case if your dough is over kneaded, which can happen, especially with lighter doughs, it will start to feel tense and too tight, almost like you've sort of like woven these proteins together too tightly. So it'll start to have a lot of tension, but then it will also start breaking again when stretched. And I think that has to do with, again, still, it's like now it's too tense. It can't stretch the way that we need it to. So really you're trying to find that sweet spot between enough gluten development and enough strands and cross links that it will hold your air bubble in, but not too tense and not too tightly wound that it can't expand when those air bubbles expand.
So tell me one thing before I forget about it.
Yeah.
Is flinging your bread dough ever required?
You could, in a way that's stretching it, and you're sort of using the gravity and the force behind the actual like volume of your bread to test and see if it stretches. I like that method also. I find it very cathartic, and I think it definitely works.
Who is it that says you want to take out your? Oh no, it's Kate who says like take out your aggression on the dough instead of the dog.
Yes.
So please do that.
It works for me, so I can recommend it, that's for sure.
Okay, what else?
Last thing really is that various ingredients can impact gluten development in different ways. So that was something that I really didn't think about before coming into this, was that actually things that you put into your dough can have an effect on how your gluten is developing and how soon it will be ready and how much kneading it needs. And the first is that salt actually strengthens the bonds that gluten forms. So if your dough is feeling a little bit tacky, make sure that you did add the right amount of salt, or maybe you need a little bit more. And then fats like butter or oils actually prohibit gluten development because they're coating the individual protein strands, and it makes it a lot harder for them to bond. So we can go back to that metaphor of spaghetti in the colander, and how if you just let it sit with nothing on it, all of the spaghetti strands will sort of like all their sides will stick together and it will form this just like mass of spaghetti. If you cover it with a little bit of oil, they'll stay separate. The same thing is really happening to the gluten strands in your bread dough. And so that's why enriched doughs like brioche or challah or what you made today take a longer mixing time than non-enriched doughs, because all of the fat content in the dough is prohibiting the gluten strands from bonding with each other.
So Malory, you made rye rolls this afternoon. How did they go?
They went pretty well. It was interesting to work with rye. I know that watching the bakers do it in the tent was a little bit different. So speaking and looking back towards gluten, what makes rye tricky is that rye has a very, very low gluten content compared to normal wheat flour. And so getting it to rise and hold air in the same way as traditional flour can be very tricky. And so most of the bakers in the tent combined rye flour with normal flour, and that's what I did as well. And then I think the other tricky thing about rye is that it's got kind of a strange flavor on its own. And so I ended up doing rye rolls with cranberry and orange zest. And then in half of mine, I did like a black sesame swirl of ground toasted black sesame with honey and sugar. And I think that combination of flavors worked pretty well. But after I baked them, I think now I really want to go back and do a savory rye roll, just because now that I understand a lot more about the flavor of rye, having baked it and eaten it, I think that rye just lends itself to savory flavors so much better. But we saw so many of our bakers in the tent do sweet rye rolls that I guess I thought that would maybe be a good idea. Like I think specifically Kate's orange and cardamom rolls, which was first of all, obviously one of my favorites because I'm obsessed with cardamom, as we know. So that was interesting. And then the fact that you have to bake it with steam. This is really the first time I think in the series that we see bakers baking with the tray of steam in there. And that I ended up looking into as well because I was curious about the purpose of that. And basically the steam helps to continue to let the rye dough get a final rise in the oven and prevents a crust from forming on the top too soon. But then also later in the bake, the water molecules from the steam actually help caramelize the sugars in the crust. And so at first, it limits the formation of the crust so you get a nice rise in the oven. And then towards the end, it helps caramelize the crusts of bread so that you get just a nice, crispy, golden outside. Did you have to do that for any of your bakes today, Nick? I'm curious.
No, I made the ciabatta, which they specifically, they don't say you should use that. And then I made another rich dough, which you don't really want a crispy base on
Exactly.
or crispy crust on anyway, so I didn't use it. Have I ever tried it? I think I may have done it once before when I made a crusty country loaf, probably in a Dutch oven. But I think that's probably the closest I've ever come to using like a steam injected oven or like what they use where they dump hot water into a pan.
Yeah.
I haven't done it very often.
Pro tip. Put the pan in the oven and then dump the water in. Don't try and move a shallow pan full of water,
Oh no,
full of hot water across your kitchen. I feel like we watched one of the bakers do that. Maybe I made that up, but yeah.
I think someone on Instagram did that recently where they were following some like famous Instagrammer's recipe and she just like threw a glass into the oven and I was like, no, why would you do that?
Oh no.
But yeah, no, don't try that.
Yours are some things we do not recommend. Did you have any favorite bakes from the rye rolls?
I thought that, no surprise here, I thought Nancy's rye roll, the cider, pear, and walnut with like the croquelan style top.
Sounded so good.
It sounded amazing. So like when I said I wanted, I think it was Kate's biscuits, the ones with the apple on top, I really like wanted that to work. And I guess Nancy's rye rolls did work with the pear and the cider. And the topping she made included like the cider and oils that like all went together with her bake, and I was like, that is a good idea. I don't think I've ever seen that before in a bread, that topping, but it looked beautiful.
It seems to be a pretty classic thing. Like I think she's brought it up multiple times about just like a traditional like coating on a roll like that, but it's not something I've ever seen before. I think my favorite overall was probably Louis's rolls, the opposites attract rolls, because first of all, he worked in parsnips and carrots into each of the doughs, which I was not expecting, but it clearly worked very well because Paul called it pure alchemy and Louis got the second Hollywood handshake of the show.
There we go. The Hollywood handshake. Good job, Louis. I mean, I knew you were going to bring those up. Those were spectacular rolls. Did you include anything like molasses or treacle or like coffee or chocolate into your rolls? That's something that Paul said that like most bakers will add these things because they want their rolls to be dark. Did you do that or is it just the honey?
No, I left my rolls pretty light and I sweetened it with honey. I didn't want to buy any molasses or treacle or anything like that. I didn't feel the need. And I was keeping it pretty light with my flavors. The cranberries and the orange zest are pretty light. And then the black sesame seeds bring a little bit of darkness, a little bit of bitterness, but it wasn't anything that I felt I wanted a really dark base for. But I might explore that in the future, especially if I do a more savory roll recipe, maybe doing a little bit of molasses or something instead of honey. But I'm not sure. I kind of liked how light it ended up being. I think people just go for the color and the dark color, but I think the flavor that comes from that may or may not be what you're looking for. I don't know.
They're like used to the like dark pumpernickel, and that's not what you're making.
Exactly.
So if you were to make a savory one, what would you throw in there?
Oh, I don't know yet. I think it would be really interesting to try and almost fill it like a steamed dumpling or a steamed bun almost. Ooh. But like I feel like whenever I think of rye, I think of Reuben's. And so I think I'd probably do some sort of flavor combination that would be sort of reminiscent of a Reuben sandwich, whether that's, I don't know. I still have to think on that, but I will definitely be posting any updates to the Instagram if I decide to go down that road for sure.
I haven't eaten a lot of rye in my day, so I kind of struggled at thinking of like what would go with this flavor. And a few recipes I found online that I thought were really cool. Whereas there was like a caraway swirl rye roll, which was more visibly interesting. And then there was one that I thought I actually might like a lot, which was a malt and rye pretzel roll.
Ooh.
So that's the idea where you dip the roll in water and baking soda, and that gives it that pretzel crust on the outside.
That actually sounds amazing.
Right?
Wow.
And I'm not sure what the malt would do there, but like rye already has this like fascinating kind of bitter flavor, so like it might go along with that. So it'd be really interesting to try.
Yeah, I think malt would complement that.
So that was the signature. I tried the technical.
Nick, I want to hear all about this. Watching the bakers make ciabatta was so stressful. I had no idea that you could make a bread with dough that wet. And if you haven't seen this episode, ciabatta dough looks like slime. I don't know how you mold it. I don't know how you manage to get it into anything that resembles bread. And so I'm so intrigued on how you managed to make this happen.
So this is right up the alley of what you were talking about earlier. All the ingredients in this bread are flour, water, and salt and yeast. That's all there is in this dough. And so what you do is you add a lot of water to it, and it does make this horribly sticky dough. And so I followed along with the masterclass, and with PBS and BBC have these recipes online. And honestly, if you're using a stand mixer, it's super easy to do. All I had to do was go find a large square container, and it just worked beautifully. My bread flour might have been a little bit out of date, so it like grew kind of strange, but once it was out, you very liberally dust it with flour and semolina, and you try to touch it as little as possible. I know that I think it was Louis who said like, just try not to touch your bread dough very much, and it just like immediately cuts to Diana just like prodding it like a cat, just touching her bread dough over and over. And I was like, oh that's a dig. But yeah, basically the idea is you don't touch it very much. And it just does this weird magic of growing several times its size. I think it was 40 minutes in, and it was already like 3 times it was when it started. So I was impressed by that. And it just goes to show that saying wetter is better is totally true with this dough. That the wet, sticky dough is all that this needs. You do not need to touch it very much at all.
Wow.
So you let the mixer go for 15 minutes, which you think is not that long, but is very, very long to have something slapping around in your KitchenAid. But once it's done, it goes in a bowl. It just sits there. You cut it really quickly and throw it in the oven. It does not need that steam like we were talking about earlier. So it just worked beautifully. They ended up looking a little misshapen, like most of the bakers there. They were not flat, which was ideal. So they didn't look like a pita bread, like Paul says. And they tasted shockingly well. You had some. Did you like it?
I loved it. So if you decide to make your own ciabatta, listeners, I was graciously gifted some from Nick, and I warmed it back up in the oven, sliced it in half, almost like a sub bread. I don't know what you call that actually. But then just spread it with warm butter and honey, and it was amazing. And it was amazing plain as well, but something about that like butter and honey combo on there was just fantastic.
And you remember like it had sort of a crispy crust because it was just like freshly baked, but it wasn't like a hard French baguette.
Right. Which is something that I found interesting, was that in the episode, this was supposed to be the Italian response to a baguette. And so I thought it would be much more similar, but it's really its own role.
Yeah, it's really cool. And as Paul says, there's no olive oil in the recipe, which is very strange because I looked up a couple other recipes for ciabatta, and Paul Hollywood's recipe on BBC includes olive oil. And I was like, no, what is this? So there were like 2 Paul Hollywood recipes that included olive oil and didn't include olive oil. Look for the one that does not include olive oil, because ciabatta shouldn't have it. Pro tip.
Wow. Interesting. So then you also tried the showstopper as well, which was impressive to me.
So I did the ciabatta a couple of days ago, and then I tried something this afternoon. Did it go well? Maybe not, but I tried. I made a Swedish cinnamon star bread, So think of your cinnamon roll, but like jazzed up. So it's twisted and folded. It's exactly the kind of folding that both Richard and Jordan did for their loaves, but it just has like a butter cinnamon sugar spread in the middle, which honestly, anything with hot cinnamon sugar is going to be totally fine.
Agree.
So when I was making my dough, it did not turn out the way I expected at all. It was full with butter and sugar and egg yolks, and I was getting this very broken dough that wouldn't stretch and more kind of cracked, or it was very, very thick. Is that common for enriched doughs, you think?
I mean, it sounds like what I was talking about earlier, and that all that fat is going to inhibit the ability of the different gluten strands to sort of combine with one another. How long did you end up mixing it for?
So I think I tried mixing it in the mixer itself, like the stand mixer, for 5 minutes, and that was not working well. It was just like running itself around the outside of the bowl. So then I took it out and started kneading it by hand, and it like slowly got better, but it just felt like a biscuit dough more than a bread dough.
Yeah, I would say that's pretty typical of enriched doughs. I think the trick is just to knead it by hand for longer than you would a normal dough, and to have some patience with it. The other thing that I haven't made a lot of enriched doughs, so I'm definitely not an expert on it, but my worry would be that if there is some butter content, that you don't necessarily want that melting. And so maybe making sure that your hands aren't super warm while that kneading is happening. But that's something I would have to look into to be sure about.
My problem was I couldn't knead it very well, because if two pieces like broke off, they wouldn't smush back together the way they should. They would just like lump together and just like smack into each other. It was very, very weird. But all in all, it turned out good. It was the idea where you like stack up 4 layers and twist all the sides and pinch them together. You should see them on our Instagram story from a week or so before, or whenever we're recording this. You'll have seen them on our Instagram story, but also I'll post a bunch on the Instagram itself. So just to let you know, it looked really pretty when it came out of the oven. It was all twisty and crispy, and it wasn't poofing up like a regular bread dough should, but it turned out not half bad. It didn't even need the like glaze that I added on top. It was sweet enough as it was, and it was pretty great. What would you do if you had to make a felt center piece loaf?
I don't know. So I was trying to think about this, and I know that you modeled yours, at least the shape, off of Richard and Jordan. I think both did a very similarly shaped loaf. And I really like the idea of, so Nancy did that full, what'd she call it? Full English breakfast roll. That sounded amazing.
Stromboli.
Mm-hmm. Ian's Moroccan roll was one of my favorites. And then I thought Kate's idea of the prosciutto, olive, and coriander or cilantro roll sounded also really good. I'm trying to think of what I would do. I mean, I know pesto is like maybe a little bit basic, but there's just something about bread and pesto together.
Pesto.
Or maybe
very exotic.
Or maybe instead an olive tapenade instead to go inside that. I think that would maybe be the direction that I had. Or some sort of like puttanesca almost based sauce to go inside, but then like really sort of like heavy and chunkier than a traditional like pasta sauce would be. But I think that would make it a really like nice salty loaf with still like really yummy bits of olive or tomato in there as well.
Trying to find a recipe for this was so unbelievably hard, because if you look for a filled loaf of bread in America, all you're going to find is so much cheese. Oh my God. The recipes for cheesy bread are endless. And it's mostly like you get a loaf of bread and you chop it into bits and you like fill it with cheese and you bake it. And you're like, that's sort of a filled loaf. Not really. Just there was literally so much. The one thing I found that I thought was really pretty looking was kind of a braid. So not like a plait where you're like twisting several together, but where it's kind of like the stromboli where you're like lacing it over itself.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was like a pretty looking one, but there's so much cheese in the world. Though we are separate today, we're not drinking tea together. This brings me into our tea time question. Malory, it's time for tea. Is banana bread bread?
No, it's a cake.
So I looked this up, and I think some people definitely agree with you. But like if you look for like a fruit-filled loaf, all you find is banana bread, zucchini bread, and pumpkin bread, and you're like, this isn't a filled loaf. This isn't even bread. So go for it.
I think it really just depends on what your definition of bread is. And we look back to the history of bread and really what it was, I think for me, for a bread to be a bread, it really needs to rise, and it needs to rise from yeast. So when bread first became a thing, it was really just all like sourdoughs or yeast that were active in the air, and that was making a mixture of flour and water rise together. And like maybe over time that they began adding salt or oil or things like that. But I think for me, for a bread to be a bread, there has to be yeast.
I mean, if you look it up by quote unquote definition from AKA Google, it says a food made from flour, water, and yeast, or another leavening agent. So that's where it comes in.
See, that's where I think it's cheating. Because cake is leavened, but you wouldn't call cake bread.
Also true. It's flour, water, and a leavening agent.
Apparently, I have strong opinions about this.
I mean, yeah, there was... Oh, yes. So I looked it up online. Alice Medrich from Food 52 has this great article called You Say Bread, I Say Cake. And she agrees with you that, like, banana bread is not a bread. It's a cake. It's lightly sweetened, but there's still like a lot of sugar in there. It's a cake in the shape of a bread loaf.
Firm agree from me.
I'd say I'm probably right there with you. It is not really bread. I mean, it's quote unquote a quick bread, but I think that just means that quick breads fall into cakes. Though also, there's definitely some savory quick breads. And then that's again where, what does it fall into? Is it a cake or a bread? How often do you have cheese in a cake? Cheesecake.
Well, it doesn't need to be a cake to not be a bread, I think.
I guess so. Quick breads have become their own thing that are not bread, is what we're saying.
Exactly. I think for it to be a bread, it needs to be leavened with yeast.
You heard it here first, folks. Quick breads are not breads. We are staking our claim on that. That's what we've decided here on our very professional show. And that brings us to the end of the show there.
Yeah, I was really proud of Louis this week. He definitely deserved Star Baker, which he got. I think just like every single bread that he put out there that day was like fantastic. And he was definitely an inspiration for me looking to try and make my own breads. And I might give a go at his rye roll recipe too if I do end up doing a savory version. And the concept of adding like shredded vegetables to it, I just thought was so cool. So that was really exciting to see him get Star Baker this week.
Louis got Star Baker, but Jordan, however, did not make it through this episode. What a trooper. He did some very interesting bakes in his time in the tent.
Really fun bakes.
He still definitely bakes a lot in his free time, but he did not make it past episode 3. So if you want to look him up, the only place I can find him online was La Petite Lion, or La Petite Lion on Twitter. He used to run a blog called Muffin Impossible.
That is adorable.
Right? It's so Jordan, though, which no longer exists, which is upsetting. And he still occasionally tries some new wacky bakes. Most recently, in 2017, he did a brownie tart with Cadbury cream eggs in it, which is wacky. He did a banana bread baked into a cheesecake, which again looks fascinating. He and his girlfriend got married in Vegas around early 2019. So like, happy first year anniversary almost. This will come out a month after their anniversary. He posts on Twitter so often where he like works with Nottingham Cake Club for charity. He works with Knott's TV and radio. He fosters kittens, which is super cute. He is still a proper nerd through it all. He pimped out his Nintendo Game Boy, like the original yellow Game Boy with yellow screen, and he de-yellowed it, and he added a backlight, and it looks gorgeous now. Good job, nerds. He calls out the handshakes. So we mentioned this in one of the first episodes that like at first handshakes weren't that big a deal, and they became a big deal, and in Series 8 they just like start handing them out. And she posts a great meme that's just, you get a handshake, everyone gets a handshake. So he's calling them out for the handshakes. They should be reserved for the best of the best.
Well, hats off to Jordan then.
Hats off to Jordan.
Well, and that's it. That brings us to the end of our episode today. We would love it if you let people know about the show and if you like it. My recipe for rye rolls, once I get it written up, I definitely just threw them together today and didn't really follow much of a specific recipe. I know that gives like Nick probably is cringing with me just saying that. But once I have that recipe written up, it will be up on our website and you'll be able to navigate to episodes and then find our post for this episode and try out the recipe for yourself. If you do make it, definitely let us know how it went. We would love to hear from you about that. I don't know. I'm really excited. That's like something I'm very much looking forward to is seeing attempts at the different recipes as well.
If you do make your recipe, let us know. You can find us on Twitter and on Instagram at HotBopod, as well as on Facebook at facebook.com/HotBopod. That is HOTBOPOD. You can find all of our links to our social media accounts on our website, hotbopod.com. Or if you really want, hatsofftobakeoff.com also works. That is HOTBOPOD.com. You can find us on Apple, on Google, on Stitcher, on Spotify. Tell your friends and family, all your loved ones and people you care about to listen to us. Every subscription, every download you give us helps us out tons, and we love you all the more for it. I'd also like to give a hats off to Peter Lalish, who wrote our intro and outro music. You can find Peter on Fiverr as PW Lalish, as well as on Bandcamp under the name AKLF. I hope you enjoyed this show. I hope you'll tune in again in 2 weeks when we get our Just Desserts in Dessert Week.
I'm so excited.
As Sue says, have you got your thermal girdle on? On your marks.
Get set. Bake.